Good to be with you all. And I just, by default, this is a really special opportunity for me, and just need you to know, in case you're keeping score, because Will introduced me this morning, he ensured that I will be the oldest person on stage today. And so I'm still kind of getting used to that, you know? Like, it's interesting, you turn 40, and then all of a sudden, your dentists start being younger than you, right? Like, this happened a couple of years ago, and I'm like, no, I need to see someone else. Would you please send a grown-up in here? That'd be great. I'm confident, though, that at least my politicians will always be older than me, though. I think that's the one thing we're guaranteed. I'll say this. This is special, not just because I came over from Oklahoma City to be with you all this morning. It's special because I think that every time a group of students step on stage on a Sunday morning and lead worship on a Sunday morning for the first time, or every time that a church sets aside a special offering to make camp accessible and an encounter with Jesus accessible for as many students as possible, I think every time, Avery, just really solid. Thank you for leading us in that. Every time a student leads us in a communion moment, I think it's God's way of casting a vote in the next generation. Like, I think it's God's way of saying, yeah, the last 40 years have been great at Christ Church Flagstaff, but wait till you see what I have in store for the next 40. I have an opportunity to stand before you this morning after working a couple of decades at Christ in Youth and working, create experiences and events for students and spending my career thus far working with students. But I also want you to know that I come to you today not only as a professional youth worker, but I also come to you today as a dad of a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old. And I can tell you, in raising these two girls, that after spending a couple of decades working with students, nothing prepared me to actually have a student live in my house. Like, it's a whole new deal when the teenagers come home with you, right? And the call is coming from within the house, right? I recognize just how unqualified I am in saying anything to you about teenagers. We've got this brand new rule in our house, just as a matter of like a week ago. Like, there are these teenagers in our house and they come over for sleepovers, and my wife and I have set this precedent that, hey, when you have friends over, just so you know, any food on the island, right, in the kitchen island, you may have that. Stay out of the pantry, right? That is where our lunches are, right? Do not eat the brown sugar. You've got to stick with the snacks that we bought for you. I understand now when God set up Eden and he said, you may eat of anything. But if you go into the pantry, surely you will die, right? But here's the interesting thing about raising teenagers. No matter how unqualified you are, no matter how uncertain you are, no matter how turbulent it may be, here's what I do believe. I come to you today extremely optimistic about what God is doing in the next generation. And I think if they were collectively telling us one thing, it's this: I got it. I got it. My 15-year-old, she turned 15 a couple of weeks ago. She's in driver's ed this weekend. Right? Yeah, big deal. A friend asked my wife yesterday how I was handling this big milestone moment. And my wife said, he left the state. That's because it was this same girl just a few months ago who I take, driving in the back part of our neighborhood. They're building back there. So they've laid the roads, but there are no houses or, more importantly, pedestrians back there. So I move into the passenger seat of our truck and I toss her the keys and we drive back into this unmarked area. And she's really just like idling down the street and trying to make this big turn, right? And she's turning and all of a sudden we're on a curb, right? And I say to her from the passenger seat in my calmest dad voice possible, you're on a curb, you're on a curb, you're on a curb. And she says to me, white knuckles, I got it. She did not got it. But I think they believe that they do, and I believe they are ready. And there's something about this is the way the church works, and it has for generations. The church only advances. The kingdom only expands if one generation, when it's time and when it's appropriate, moves from the driver's seat to the passenger seats and lets young people step on stage and lead and begin to say just that, I got it. And then with the appropriate amount of guidance and occasionally grabbing the steering wheel and guiding and directing, letting them do it. And my friends, by just doing this morning, you are saying, yeah, we want in. We want in on that. And I think that also echoes Jesus' ministry quite a bit too. Look, Jesus' earthly ministry, he could have done it many different ways. But for some reason, Jesus had this plan that when he stepped into the spotlight, while he could have reigned and could have led there for years, as soon as he stepped into his public ministry, he began to recruit people who he would hand over the ministry to. Like immediately. And there's something about that's just kind of the way that ministry and church works. And I'm optimistic about the next generation. They don't have it all figured out. They still hit the occasional curb. No doubt, we all do. But I'm extremely optimistic about the next generation because I believe they're responding to Jesus in some pretty incredible ways. That they want to be engaged. They want to serve. They want to lead. And what I'd like to do this morning is I'd like to walk through and examine some ways that Jesus called his earliest disciples to follow him. Because I think that the next generation is responding to Jesus in the same way that that first generation did. And so we start early in Jesus' ministry with one of the disciples he called, named Matthew. Matthew, who penned the first gospel in the New Testament. Matthew's got an interesting backstory. And when Jesus arrives on the scene, more than just his backstory, Matthew has a really interesting present moment. So Matthew grew up a Jewish kid, living in Jerusalem, working and living and just kind of connected to the community. But there was an interesting socioeconomical climate in those days where the Roman government had acquired, and once again, the Jewish people were living under an authoritative rule. And the Roman government had this really sinister and, really systematic way of oppressing their people. And the Romans would establish these outposts and they would recruit natives, like Jewish people. And they would recruit them and they would make them tax collectors. They would call them to turn their backs on their families and on their natives, their families and their neighbors, and serve the enemy, work on behalf of the enemy. And Matthew signed up for this. We understand through his writings that Matthew, like his faith and his heritage, still meant a lot to him. And so we don't understand why Matthew did this. I mean, there's lots of reasons you could assume. Sometimes all of us just instinctively want to make sure we're on the right side of history. And man, if everything goes crazy, it'd be nice to be connected to power. Or maybe it's more practical. Maybe the money was just too good. And Matthew said, okay, I can swallow this pill. Let's do it. But Matthew had turned his back on his friends and neighbors and become a tax collector. And that's when Jesus entered the scene. Matthew was a mess. Matthew was carrying, I assume, a lot of shame and isolation, a lot of weight. And my friend says, while I am extremely optimistic about the next generation, I also know that they are doing the same, that there's a lot on their shoulders. We understand that 1 in 3 young people struggle with anxiety. 2 out of 5 will have some kind of traumatic experience happen to them by the time they're 15. 70% of young people are consuming pornography on a weekly basis. They are weighed down by this. And yet, Jesus locks eyes with them, and they are responding. So in Matthew chapter 9, we see this. We see this where Jesus shows up, and it says, as Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew, this is our guy, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Follow me, he said. And Matthew got up and followed him. This is pretty interesting. I think there's something to say about the next generation, but I think there's also something to be said for all of us. That Jesus encounters Matthew in the midst of his betrayal, in the midst of doing the thing, right, that is keeping him far from God and from his people. And yet in the midst of Matthew's betrayal, in the midst of Matthew's, let's call it what it is, sin, Jesus locks eyes with him and asks him to follow him in spite of that. And I think that is a reminder to all of us that no matter how far you feel from God, no matter how isolated, no matter how current your rebellion is, if you lock eyes with Jesus, you are not too far gone. And Jesus' offer to you is to leave behind whatever life you have built for yourself and follow him. And the next generation is doing this. Do you all know this? Look, you can wring your hands and talk about kids these days, but let me tell you about kids these days. Because here's the fascinating thing. They are responding, some would say, in record numbers. Did you know that currently more Gen Z and millennial people, young people, are attending church than Boomers and Gen Xers? There are more young people in church than there are old people. Now, they weren't at the 8:30 service, right? They weren't there. That should be an incredible encouragement to us that the future of the church is bright. Now, here's the problem, though. They're also probably the most interactive and engaged generation we've ever seen. We are raising a generation who do not want to consume, who do not want to simply sit back and watch. They want to contribute. And so while we are really concerned about their attendance, we should be more concerned about their activation and calling them to participate. Church is not a spectator sport for them. Nothing is. They don't consume media like we do. They are always engaged, always putting their fingerprints on it, and they want to do the same with church. And so we have to create space for them to serve. There was another disciple that Jesus called named Andrew. And Andrew, ironically enough, was already in the game by the time Jesus showed up. But we see this in John chapter 1, that before Jesus' ministry officially launched, there was another guy who was reaching people and baptizing people and preaching about a coming kingdom named John the Baptist. And John the Baptist knew that no matter how big his followership got, no matter how many people he drew to follow him, he knew his primary responsibility was to create a following, to stir up some trouble in the desert, and then ultimately make way for Jesus, the Messiah. In fact, John later told his disciples, hey, it's not my job to be the Messiah. In fact, my job is to decrease, and so Jesus can increase. But I'm sure that there was probably still a little bit of tension with John. That when Jesus began calling people to himself, that meant that his numbers began to dwindle. And one of those guys was a guy named Andrew. And so we see in John chapter 1 that Jesus is walking by where John the Baptist is gathered and some people, and they begin to notice Jesus. John points to Jesus, and we see this. Turning around, Jesus saw them following. These are now John's former disciples following him, and asked, what do you want? They said, Rabbi, which means teacher, where are you staying? Come, he replied, and you will see. So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who had heard what John had said about and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, we have found the Messiah, that is, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas, which is translated Peter. It's interesting. Andrew recognizes Jesus, recognizes that there is something different about him, abandons everything to follow Jesus. And his first assignment wasn't to preach a sermon. It wasn't to coordinate a worship set. It wasn't to perform a miracle. It wasn't to do any number of churchy type things. No, his first assignment as a disciple was to make an invitation. And I think sometimes we assume, man, I want to serve Jesus. I want to do something for Christ Church, but like I don't lead worship, and I wouldn't be great on a stage, and my skills don't align, whatever it might be. But I can tell you this, like all of us have an opportunity to make an invitation. You know that 82%, Relevant Magazine posted this a couple years ago, 82% of adults would accept an invitation to church if someone invited them, if a friend invited them. 82%. We go, no, we think they're too busy or they're uninterested. And I think they're going, no, I'm just waiting. I'm just waiting to be invited. And that should give us an incredible amount of hope for the next generation, because people are waiting for an invitation, and early indications tell us that Gen Alpha might be the most evangelistic generation we've ever seen. Like roughly 80% of surveyed teens say they feel comfortable inviting friends to church. And about 3/4 of them, more than that, feel comfortable sharing their personal faith stories. They are naturally evangelistic. They naturally want to talk about what Jesus has done in their life. And we ask ourselves, why? This is a theory. It's nothing more than a theory. I don't have any scientific proof to back it up. But here's why I think. We have given them, since the time they were little devices with little screens, and they have become curators. They have become content makers. They are very articulate and comfortable with talking into a screen and recording and telling their story and documenting their lives, that I think, while there's a lot of issues, right, with screen time and all and the anxiety it produces and all that kind of stuff, I don't want to belittle that. But what if God has been working ahead of us and is working to redeem this innate ability that they have built to be able to tell their story and tell the difference that Jesus has made in their lives? What if? And there's incredible power in that, not just for our students, but for ourselves as well. The power of the invitation. The power to stand with Andrew, right, and say, hey, would you come with me? I think I found the Messiah. It could change somebody's life. My wife and I our family started attending a church 4 years ago. So I work in ministry, but I work at a parachurch organization. I don't work inside a church. So that means my Sunday mornings are spent in the seats. I get to serve and attend, like most people do. But we were attending a new church about 4 years ago or so, and we'd been attending for a couple of months, and it was beginning to feel like home. Like I think this is our place. I think we are belong here, and we're looking forward to serving here. But my wife said, I love coming here, but you know what I'm missing? I'm just looking forward to the moment that someone, not on staff, but someone knows us, sees us, recognizes. Like I want to be seen, known at church. And it wasn't a couple weeks after that after the service dismissed and during that kind of awkward shuffle out time, that a couple of rows over, our now good friend Tim and his wife Amber saw us and looked at us and said, hey, look, it's the Eppersons. Crossings became our church home in that moment. And yeah, the worship's great and the preaching's great and the content's great and I get that. But I don't want to consume, I want to connect. And Tim, who is not a pastor, and as far as I know has never stood on a stage, made that connection for us. That is the call to each of us. That is the way we each can serve on a Sunday morning here. My friends, the conversation starters they put on the screen at the end of the service, right? I won't spoil it for you, right? Yeah, introverts begin to kind of go into their shell and go, oh no, not this moment again. But I'm telling you, that might be the moment that this church feels like home for somebody. You get to do that. Our students are doing that. I think that's one of those moments we begin to follow their lead. My friends, there's something powerful about making space for people to come to Jesus. And that's exactly what happened in the third story that I'll share with you briefly this morning. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus' ministry had begun to kind of grow and expand, and people began to recognize, like, this guy's teaching differently than all the other rabbis. In fact, in the Sermon on the Mount, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, they recognize that Jesus is speaking with authority and power. It's not just about the words, it's about something underneath the words. And so naturally, people were drawn to him, and he began to develop a little bit of a reputation in following. And every time he would show up to speak somewhere, like, there would be overflow, like standing room only kind of situation. And we see it in Mark chapter 2, this one moment, when it says this: a few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. And they gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left in this house where he was teaching, not even outside the door. And he preached the word to him. And so there's this commotion going on. And we understand that there are these friends of a guy who was paralyzed and had been as long as he can remember. But they'd heard about Jesus, and they recognized, like, if somehow we can get our friend to Jesus like that, maybe Jesus could do something. And so this Bible tells us they gathered around, they picked up his mat on those four corners, and they began to make their way carrying their friend to Jesus. But the house was so full, this crowd was so large that they couldn't get to him. And so we continue. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof. Again, not their home, right? Like that is not a good way to get a good Airbnb review, right? Like to tear a hole in the roof. They made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and they began to lower the mat to where Jesus was. The Bible tells us this: when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." That is a desperate situation. And I think the call to all of us is this: like, how desperately are we willing to be to get those we love and know to the feet of Jesus? How radical are our actions? What kind of roof are we willing to tear off to make sure that our friends and our kids and our teenagers have an opportunity to experience Jesus up close and personal? A really interesting caveat in this: the Bible says that Jesus saw not the man's faith, but their faith. I think Jesus is looking at each of us going, okay, you say you have faith in me, but what kind of move are you willing to make? How desperately are you willing to act to get your students, your kids, this community to Jesus? Which is why I think it's an interesting moment for me, because I recognize that I'm an invited guest here, right, this morning, and I'll go home and I'm not connected like anybody else on this stage is. But I don't want to miss a moment to ask you a question, because I know that, like, Will stood up here a little bit ago with a flyer and talked about the offering that you guys are doing to try to make camps as accessible as possible. I was just talking to Chris a little bit ago. You know, 1/3 of your congregation will go to camp this summer? 1/3. And what you all are doing, I was walking through the hallways before the service, and Will was pointing out, like, there's a poster on that side of the building with prices for camp. And we serve roughly 1,500 churches every summer. And so I want to be honest with you. Like, how accessible and affordable camp is for your kids, I'll be blunt with you. No one else is doing that. Like, no, I might just send my daughter to Flagstaff and she can go with you guys, because that's a huge, huge discount. You all, and I know it's not free, you all are shouldering that. And I want to commend you. But I also want to challenge you, because there might be somebody in this room that if you make a phone call or write a check, could literally cover that lift. And you may not know a student, and you may never ride a bus to camp, and you may have no interest in being a small group leader, but you can still be a part of that story. You can still remove that roof, remove that barrier by using the leverage that God has given you. May God in that moment see your faith and respond in the life of a young person. But the second challenge, maybe, it might not be to give, but it might be to serve. And it might be to find some time in your weekly schedule or in your Sunday nights to pick up a mat and to help carry a student to the feet of Jesus through serving in the children's ministry or the youth ministry. You might go, man, I'm not relevant. I'm too old. I've got nothing to say to a student. And I go, maybe. But can I tell you this? This is an old youth ministry adage, that students are instinctively drawn to the oldest person in a room who will pay attention to them. You might have the oldest person in the room part down. Great, check. You're just one step away from making a difference in a young person's life if you'll just make yourself available. And then may Jesus see your faith and heal and change a kid's life. Will's gonna have you think about making a gift today. Can I just, as a friend and as just a cheerleader and as a believer in what God's doing here and as very much an outsider, right? I live 900 miles east on Route 66 away from here. Okay, but I think God's doing something special here. I know that by the lift that you guys are willing to make. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not be the one to preach the sermon, but be the one that makes sure a young person hears it. Way back at the beginning of the 1900s, there was a traveling evangelist in those days named Mordecai Ham. And Mordecai Ham was one of those traveling evangelists, big tent revival kind of preachers. And Mordecai Ham had really kind of acquired quite the following. But there's this story goes that Mordecai Ham was preaching in one of those big revivals, and the tent was completely full of people. When two young boys, they were about 12 years old, rode by on their bikes and they saw this commotion, and it was the early 1900s, right? There's no Netflix, so they're like, well, let's check this thing out. And so they go over to this tent and they hear the preaching, and they begin to look inside the tent, and they go, man, this is okay, we should stick around for this. But much like a morning like this morning, there's not really a place to sit. And so they kind of go up and down the aisles and go, well, maybe we'll just take off. And so the story goes, they turn and they leave the tent and start to walk away, going back to do whatever kids did in the 1900s, throw rocks in a river or something. I don't know, something like that, right? But the story goes that an usher saw these two boys walking out, leaving the assembly. And so the usher left his post and ran about 100 yards away from the tent and tapped him on the shoulders and goes, boys, where are you going? They're like, well, mister, there's no seats. And he was like, well, just come with me. I'll help you find a spot. The usher walked back in and had some people move around or had some folks stand to the side and got a seat for those two boys who, through the preaching of Mordecai Ham and the power of the Holy Spirit, accepted Jesus for the first time that afternoon. One of those boys was a man named Grady Wilson, who in his adult years actually grew up to begin organizing crusades and events like the one where he gave his life to Jesus. He was kind of a behind-the-scenes guy. And he was sitting next to his friend, a 12-year-old Billy Graham, who we know as a guy who literally probably preached the gospel to more people than anybody in human history. And what's interesting about this story is we know Grady's name, and we obviously know Billy Graham's name, and we know Mordecai Ham's name. But the one name we don't know is, I think, the hero of the story. That usher, who over a century later, nobody knows his name, but he left his post and he saw two young people walking away from a chance to hear Jesus, and he abandoned everything and he removed all the obstacles and found ways to get them to experience Jesus. What if 100 years from now, no one knows your name, but you had an opportunity to have a similar experience? That's what I think God is calling us to do. Is just create space to look a young person in the eye when they say, I got it. For us to look at them, I'm not talking to them, I'm talking to you, and say back to them, I believe you do. I believe you do. Avery, I believe you do. So let's get to work. Jesus, I thank you so much for what you're doing in this generation, but more specifically in this church. And so, God, I pray that your will would be done, that your kingdom would be done in Flagstaff as it is in heaven. God, I pray that you would just become increasingly more famous in this city because of the work that's done here. We thank you for saving us and sending us, and we pray this in your name. Amen.